Welcome to Alaska Weather, a production of Alaska Public Media and the National Weather Service, Alaska Region. Produced and broadcast daily from the studios of KAKM, Alaska Weather provides complete forecasts, public, marine, and aviation for all of Alaska. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
Sometimes the best way to find a living is to stay right where you are and study with UAS online. Career-specific distance programs from the University of Alaska Southeast are the fastest way to increase your earning power.
We connect all over the world.
The National Weather Service.
And good Tuesday, everyone. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider joining you with more weather information around the heart of Alaska. It doesn't look like we're going to see a great deal of change in the next couple days, but the same old places will start to get a little more wet, a little more windy, and maybe a little bit more snow. I'll tell you where that's going to happen here in just a minute. But first, as always, want to remind you about the Alaska Weather Information Line. A great way to stay up to date just from the phone, 1-800-472-0391. Social media is always there for you as well. And the great thing about Facebook, as you well know, is its ability to share information. We like to share weather information with you, but we'd love to see your pictures from your location around Alaska. So if you've got an aurora picture, if you've got a picture of some new snow, or perhaps the snow is gone and you'd like to show that, or just a nice picture along the coast or the boardwalk, just go ahead and put that on the Facebook page, and perhaps we can share that here on Alaska Weather with everyone else. Twitter as well is a great way to communicate, especially in developing weather situations. Twitter.com/NWS Alaska is the whole state with the National Weather Service. And of course, if you'd like to localize your experience, NWS Juneau, NWS Anchorage, and NWS Fairbanks is a great way to communicate on Twitter. Weather.gov/Alaska is the place to find us online. And if you want to drop me an email or the rest of the team, nws.ar.tvweather@noaa.gov. As always, want to remind everyone about our new time schedule here for the Alaska Weather Show around the state. The ARC system, it's still live at 5:30. How you doing? That was a live hand wave there. KUAC 9.4, also live on UAF TV for the folks watching around the Fairbanks region. Hello to you. 360 North, you're watching is recorded at 7:30 each night, though Sunday has been added, and many thanks to the 360 North folks. And on Alaska Public Media stations, you'll be watching us at 5 o'clock in the morning now, the next morning. But you can also watch us on YouTube. Make sure you go to youtube.com and you can Google AKwx TV. There on the top, it will find the most recent up-to-date version there, and just scrub the little slider along if you want to skip to the marine section or just watch the aviation version there. Got some interesting weather headlines that have showed up today. October 2016 was the warmest October on record for Barrow, Kotzebue, Nome, and St. Paul. And not just by a little bit for most of those locations. Also the driest October on record for the other side of the state. Eagle, Northway, Cordova, Juneau, Sitka, and Ketchikan. Southeast was just impressively dry for October, usually one of the wetter periods there with the fall storm setting in. And it was also a relatively brown Halloween in Fairbanks, the first time since 1940 with no snow on the ground. That's a long time and kind of a different scenario for the kiddos that are walking around in the costumes. Hopefully everybody had a good, safe night last night. Now back to business in November, and you can see the business is the jet stream showing the weather moving from southeast to northwest right across southwestern Alaska, Lake Iliamna, the southern parts of Cook Inlet, and just grazing Kodiak Island today. For southeast, you can see a little bit of the weather trying to sneak in here, a little bit of light rain across southern parts of southeast. And if you look a little bit further southward, there's another batch of moisture that's trying to work its way northward now. And with that warmer, wetter air, that's the next wave of weather that's coming your way. A look out to the west shows those speckledy kind of mackerel-looking clouds there. The fish scale kind of weather indicates colder air aloft, and in that case you can also see some of that cloudiness right across the central Gulf. That's under one wave of low pressure, and another round of colder air is trying to drop in on the south side of low pressure across the central Bering Sea. Putting it all together, we have a kind of a strange blocking pattern once again. It's the same situation that really led to another dry October. We have a powerful jet well to the south of Alaska, and then rounding up and over southeast, over southwest Alaska, curving up and over, and then away into Canada. That's providing that block, keeping very dry conditions across the interior, limiting the amount of moisture for southeast, keeping conditions cold and unsettled across the Bering, and really blocking a pretty persistent weather pattern that would allow cold or snow or cold and rain or just precipitation in general to reach some of the more normal places that we would consider this time of the year. Look at the weather map, shows a frontal boundary working into southern southeast, and the outer coast there sees an occlusion working its way into areas south of Sitka to Ketchikan, Craig, and Klawock, and Hyder, seeing some rainfall there. A little bit southward into Haida Gwaii, also looking at some rainfall. More clouds than anything else as you head into the northern Gulf, but it has been a really wet day for places in Homer and Seward. Over 1.2 inches of rainfall on either side of the Kenai Peninsula there. Cold Bay picked up 7/10. Kodiak saw 2/10, so maybe a liquid sunshine for you. A look further northward shows that it is cold and dry. A lot of clear sky there across the interior. Places like Bettles have 3 inches of snow on the ground. And because of that, and a pretty clear night in most cases around the northern interior, it got down to about 6 degrees there last night. So chilly stuff for sure. Northway was about 4. And Arctic Village, one of the cold spots there, 2 above this morning. So clear, cold skies on an Alaska night, that gets you some pretty serious temperature cool downs there. Low pressure across the eastern Gulf at 982 millibars later tonight will allow that warmer, wetter air to kind of move its way, creep its way northward. Might be cold enough for some snow showers around Haines and Skagway and points north, especially the higher terrain though. As you get into the northern Gulf, that's rain showers there. Southwestern Alaska, periods of rain and snow may mix across the interior, but a better chance for liquid precipitation, of course, across the coastline. As you move up across the western sections into the Bering Strait and the western tip of the Seward Peninsula, rain may mix with snow out around Wales and Tin City, but northward, you're looking at light snow across the Chukchi coast and into the coastal plain there. On the south side of the frontal boundary, as you get toward the Brooks Range summits, you're probably talking about some fog, so periods of poor visibility from time to time. Otherwise, a partly to mostly cloudy sky across the interior. As you look out west, another wave of low pressure gets organized down to a 970 millibar low. Behind that, of course, colder air, and that's what we're seeing in the form of those clouds that are kind of making that mackerel scale across the satellite picture. For south central, rain will continue around Prince William Sound and across the Gulf side of the Kenai Peninsula. Warmer, wetter air is trying to work northward, but it just can't move a whole lot further north because of high pressure sitting across British Columbia and southern Yukon. Look for some light snow around the Copper River Basin, mostly rain, of course, across the northern and western Gulf, Kodiak Island and Bristol Bay. Periods of showers across the Aleutians and the Alaska Peninsula, and snow and periods of poor visibility and low ceilings across the North Slope. For Thursday, not a whole lot of change there. High pressure will creep eastward just a bit. Low pressure drops a little bit further southward, bringing a better focus for snow showers across the south-facing slopes of the Brooks Range and maybe the interior, the middle Tanana Valley. Look for light rainfall across southwest and Kodiak, Bristol Bay, and rain continues around southeast. You'll notice this frontal boundary has gone north and then drop southward again. Eventually this will swing out of the way and won't move a whole lot further north as it looks right now. Showers across the central Bering, and that'll keep things unsettled for the central and eastern Aleutians, but watch for winds to come up across the west with gales beginning Wednesday night. As we look at temperatures today, we saw pretty mild conditions across southeast, 40s and 50s in most locations. Sitka was 50, around Haines it was 40 degrees. The capital city in the mid-40s today, Ketchikan, Metlakatla, all in the mid to upper 40s, 45 around Hyder, 51 and wet and mild in Cordova today, 45 around Valdez. It was 40 in Anchorage, 42 for Homer and Seward Kenai, milder still at 46. Golcana had 26 degrees with Northway at 20. Fairbanks was showing 31 with Healy at 48 degrees, I should say, 23 at Fort Greely and 32 in Eagle. Fort Yukon had about 14 degrees late this afternoon. And Arctic Village, once again, after a start around 2, made it up to a whopping 17 with low to mid-teens for the Beaufort Seacoast there around Prudhoe Bay and Dead Horse. Point Barrow was 30 degrees, 26 in Wainwright, 34 for Kivalina, and Kotzebue had 38. Shishmaref showing 34, 42 in Nome, 40 in Unalakleet, Grayling in the mid-30s, 36 for McGrath. Bethel almost 40 degrees at 3 o'clock. And Amana closer to 42. Into Bristol Bay, lower 40s there for King Salmon and Dillingham. Lake Iliamna only in the 30s, 40 for St. Paul. St. George was 38. The Alaska Peninsula in the 30s and 40s with Sandpoint at 36. Unalaska and Dutch Harbor 42, 43 in AKwx was 39 and 38 way out in Shemya. Overnight low temperatures will be the coldest under a clear, cool, dark sky. It looks like anywhere from 1 below in Arctic Village to about 8 above in Northway, 14 above in Eagle, and 12 for Fairbanks, with south central in the lower to mid 30s, southeast in the 30s to about 42 around Sitka and Ketchikan. 30s and 40s for the Alaska Peninsula and Bristol Bay. Maybe a few places just off the coast going below freezing, as you would expect. 32 for Unalakleet and 34 for Nome, with 24 in Barrow, and the middle and eastern Aleutians probably in the mid to upper 30s. High temperatures tomorrow stay in the teens and 20s for the eastern and central interior. South central closer to 40 degrees. Prince William Sound in the mid 40s. 40s and even 50s for some of the coastal locations in southern and central southeast. The Alaska Peninsula in the lower to mid 40s. Kodiak, you're looking at 47. Nome 38 degrees, 28 in Barrow, and Arctic Village up to 19 tomorrow afternoon. On to flying weather now. IFR conditions are expected across the north slope. Look for poor visibility there through a good part of the day. Southwest hit and miss. Bethel may flirt with IFR conditions in the morning. IFR around Prince William Sound and into the southern Boundary Range Mountains, as well as areas around Haines and Skagway in the higher terrain. As we get into the afternoon, that should improve for southeast dramatically. Prince William Sound will still be fighting off IFR, especially around the Portage Valley, along the western Alaska Range, and again, hit and miss in southwestern Alaska and the YK Delta. So YK Delta pilots, be prepared for changing conditions tomorrow, as well as areas around Nome and the Seward Peninsula and across the north slope until you get to the actual coastline itself, where MVFR conditions may improve by the afternoon. Here are your pass conditions. Anaktuvik Pass, we expect to see VFR through most of the day. The north side, of course, is going to be a lot different when you get there. Going through Adigan Pass, VFR conditions, but once again, going north, you're going to find different conditions after you get out of the pass. Lake Clark and Mail Pass may hang out around IFR through a large part of the day. Rainy Pass may hold at IFR through a good chunk of the day as well. Windy Pass, we expect it to be MVFR through most of your Wednesday. Isabel Pass transitioning to IFR as the day goes on. Mentasta Pass, we expect improvements throughout your Wednesday. Tanita Pass, probably MVFR through most of Wednesday. Not a whole lot of change there. Portage Pass, especially the eastern side, is going to be stuck at IFR with improvements to the east and west of that location. And Chilkoot and White Pass, look for improvements as the day goes on, maybe finding some VFR by the afternoon. Freezing levels show that cold air is certainly winning at the surface, but aloft you can see levels as high as 4,000 to 6,000 feet for the central and western interior, out to the western Brooks Range, the Seward Peninsula, and we've still got some cold pockets around southwest, and that's the reason poor visibility is probably a better bet tomorrow. And then central and southern parts of southeast, anywhere from 4,000 to 6,000 feet there from Craig and Klawock and Ketchikan, probably seeing some warmer air creeping into your region throughout the day. Icing potential along some of those older boundaries. You can see above 4,000 to about 5,000 feet. There could be some elevated areas of icing risk there, occasional moderate perhaps, and at least light to isolated moderate around this region. And then on the backside of that, cold and wet air still trying to spill in across the western Bering Sea. For southeast, don't see a whole lot of risk until you get south of Haida Gwaii above 4,000 feet, and then anything across most of Alaska won't be very widespread or significant tomorrow. The jet stream has our high pressure system at upside down U-shaped pattern, showing a very dominant ridge across a large part of the mainland. But that southeasterly push of weather moving across the region is what's driving those surface winds there across the southwestern Capes and across the north and western Gulf. So wind speeds along the main storm track, though, well to the south, 150 to 160 knots. High pressure slowly losing across the interior. Our dominant winds across the west from the south and southwest, about 20 to 25. The strongest winds across the central and western chain, 50 to 70 knots there. And a north and easterly wind for the north slope at 20 to 35, with southeasterlies coming into southeast Alaska at 50 to 55. At 3,000 feet, you can see winds are blowing more of a northeasterly direction offshore for most of southeast Alaska. Southerlies across the western half of Alaska from 20 to 35, and north and easterly winds continue across the north slope there, with winds for the central and western chain at around 30 to 40 knots again on the south side of that low pressure system. So we're watching hit and miss chop out there below 3,000 feet. Across the west, below 4,000 feet, west of the Alaska Range and into the Seward Peninsula and Norton Sound, and across the Chukchi Coast below 4,000 feet. And for southeast, below 4,000 feet, generally south of Sitka, all the way into the Dixon entrance. That's a look at your aviation forecast. I'll be back with your marine weather here in just a few minutes. Stay tuned.
Winter. Cold, wet, and deadly. Every year, snowstorms strand hundreds of people in their cars, isolate thousands in their homes, and kill those who are unprepared. In this film, you will see and hear true stories about 6 people caught in severe winter weather and isolated from help. Ed and Paul Maluski were going to their cabin to button it up for the winter when it began to snow.
The storm hit about halfway up the mountain. By the time we got about a mile from our cabin, we kept getting stuck every 10 feet.
We were always out digging, which got us wet. Then the snow got real heavy, and you couldn't see 5 feet in front of you. It was pretty clear the Bronco wasn't going to make it, so we figured we'd walk to a neighbor's cabin. It wasn't real far, and we know that area like the back of our hands.
The funny thing is, everything changes at night. And with the blizzard, well, you couldn't tell which way you were going. I thought I knew, but boy, I just couldn't tell for sure.
Dad! Leave this back here! We don't need it! There's food in the cabin!
You know, it was funny. I'd be thinking real clear for a while, and then just didn't know what I was doing or where I was going. I couldn't even remember Paul's name. My own boy, and I couldn't remember his name.
I got worried wading through that snow. Dad was really beat. He could barely keep up. I started thinking about things I'd never thought about before. I fell and dropped our flashlight and didn't pick it up right away like you normally would. I knew we were getting delirious then. Then we hit that gate. Well, it's nowhere near the cabin.
We've gone too far! Let's go back to the Bronco!
Paul, we can't go back. We wouldn't make it. I wouldn't make it. We've got to find that cabin or we can't make it. Now, come on, we've got to find that cabin.
From then on, I just kept thinking, you gotta keep going. You gotta keep pushing.
I saw that cabin and said one long prayer. I could hardly believe we finally found it. We walked for 2.5 hours and it was less than a half mile from the Bronco. All I could think was, we had to get inside. We finally got in. And then we didn't say anything at all. We didn't talk.
Ed and Paul had become victims of hypothermia, a physical condition caused by a person's body losing more heat than it produces. The result, a dangerously low body temperature. When Ed and Paul were outside, the conditions were perfect for hypothermia to set in. It was cold, and they were tired and wet. First, their bodies tried to generate more heat to combat the cold. They began to shiver. It was a losing battle. The constant exposure to cold, wet weather defeated this first line of their body's defense. Then, in order to keep the remaining heat concentrated in the body core, the brain, heart, and lungs, their bodies began to cut down blood circulation to their arms and legs. This gave their vital organs a fighting chance to continue functioning. But it also caused the loss of muscle control in their hands, legs, and arms. As their natural defenses gradually began to break down, they became more confused and disoriented. If they had not found the cabin, the cold would have defeated all their body's defenses, and they would have died. In this kind of emergency, the first thing to do is get out of the cold. Then, carefully begin rewarming the body. The most important areas to rewarm first are those areas nearest the body core, the sides of the chest, the neck, the groin, and the head. These are the areas of highest heat loss and highest heat absorption. Warming these areas first lets the body build back and hold its heat, starting with the body core and gradually spreading to the rest of the body. Ed and Paul did not rewarm themselves correctly. They began by warming their hands and feet, and that could have killed them. Warming the body's extremities first forces cold blood to flow back to the body core. The result is usually death. Paul went to bed that night shivering uncontrollably because his body had not been rewarmed properly. Both men needed medical assistance desperately. It's a miracle they survived. Part of the miracle was the cabin they broke into. It was owned by a man who believed in being prepared for anything.
Once we got warmed up, we found plenty of wood for the fire. Besides, there was a propane tank to heat the cabin too.
There was plenty of food, enough to last us a couple of weeks. And you could eat it right out of the can. You didn't need a stove to cook it on.
Nothing. Well, they know we're gone. Yeah, they should.
Candles, flashlights, lanterns, all were on hand with plenty of batteries and fuel to keep them working. Ed and Paul even found a battery-powered radio. It was a relief to hear that rescuers were out looking for them. The cabin had a well-stocked first aid kit, too. Ed and Paul were stranded way up in the mountains, far from any help. But even in a city, snowstorms can be dangerous, especially for the elderly. The elderly can fall victim to hypothermia even at home. It's essential for them to maintain warm room temperatures of 68 degrees Fahrenheit or more. Continued exposure to low room temperatures can easily cause older people to become hypothermic, and it is very difficult to detect.
Your turn now.
They usually don't shiver as hypothermia takes hold, but their breathing may become shallow and their heartbeat may slow down. Either of these symptoms during cold weather means medical help is needed immediately. The best cure, of course, for anyone is prevention. Stay warm all the time, eat well and regularly, and keep physically fit. These factors will help protect you from winter cold.
Did you get back to the clinic this morning? Good.
And drink Ovaltine, right? Yeah, that's always the thing. Here's a look at the marine forecast for southeast northerlies coming down the Lynn Canal tomorrow at 20 knots with a 4-foot sea. 4-foot seas also for many of the interior locations. A northeasterly breeze, though, 15 to 20. Offshore winds blowing from Sitka to Craig at 20 to 25 with 12-foot seas there. More of a southeasterly wind north of Sitka toward Yakutat, 20 knots with a 10 to 11-foot sea on Wednesday. As we get into Thursday with the front getting a little bit closer, the winds are going to start switching around. Look for stronger winds developing inside of Clarence Strait. Seas coming up to 11 feet at their highest. 15-knot winds a little bit further north into the Lynn Canal, 15 to 25. 3 to 5-foot seas expected there. And the offshore winds, or the outer coast winds, I should say, in north and northwesterly direction, 20 to as high as 30 knots, blowing in from west to east into the Dixon entrance, 30 knots with a 19-foot sea on the southern end there for Thursday. Now for south central, winds are considerably lower. Look for 15 to 20 knots. Easterlies inside of Prince William Sound, and on the outside more of a southeasterly flow. Southeasterlies coming across the Barren Islands and into Kamishak Bay. Northeasterlies on the northern end of Cook Inlet, 15 knots with a 4-foot sea. 4-foot seas and easterlies inside of Shelikof Strait, with southerlies on the eastern side of Kodiak Island. For Thursday, winds diminish slightly across the north and western Gulf. In fact, winds go light and variable inside and outside of Prince William Sound with 5-foot seas in the northern Gulf. And north and easterly winds still come down Cook Inlet at only 10 to 15. And in Shelikof Strait, look for an easterly wind at 15 knots with a 3-foot sea. Southerlies on Wednesday inside of Bristol Bay, 15 knots with a 10-foot sea. Southwesterlies along the Pacific coast, 15 to 25 with 10 to 11-foot seas, and 13-foot seas down the Bering Sea coast with a southwesterly wind from 25 knots. Easterlies inside of Bristol Bay on Thursday at 15 knots with northwesterlies from Sandpoint down to False Pass with a 7-foot sea. Opposing that will be a southeasterly flow just from Castle Cape to Chignik, 15 knots with a 7-foot sea, and you can see the westerlies bending over the Alaska Peninsula on the Bering Sea coast, 20 knots with an 8-foot sea there on Thursday. For the Aleutians, look for 25 to 35 knots all areas on Wednesday, with 12 to 15 foot seas for the Bering Sea coast, 13 to 15 foot seas out across the west with 30-knot winds, and westerlies along the Pacific coast at 25 knots with 13 to 15 foot seas there, again along the south side. But watch what happens on Wednesday. Winds come up in many areas across the central and western Aleutians, 40 to 45 with gales beginning Wednesday night and probably continuing into Thursday, it looks like. 10 to 15 knots across the eastern chain, still light and variable winds there, but considerably stronger winds and higher seas, 19 to as high as 21 foot seas there around Kiska and points west for Thursday. For the west coast, not as bad. A southwesterly flow for the Kuskokwim Delta, 20 knots with a 7-foot sea. Southeasterlies over St. Lawrence Island, southwesterlies over St. Matthew, and northwesterlies around St. Paul and St. George. What a mess. 13-foot seas there for the Bering Sea around the Pribilovs. That gets light and variable as we get into Thursday, with seas holding on to around 7-foot levels there. East and northeasterlies north of Nunivak Island to St. Lawrence Island and out of Eatolan Strait. Easterlies for St. Matthew Island, 25 knots with a 9-foot sea, and easterlies off the Kuskokwim Delta, 15 knots with a 5-foot sea. That's all for Thursday. And for the North Slope, easterlies going strong and could bring in some freezing spray, which could be heavy at times as well, so watch for warnings there. 25 to 30 knots across the Beaufort Sea coast and 20 to 30 for the Chukchi coast, with occasionally winds out of the north and east. For Thursday, well, it still looks like open waters there, 25 to 30 knots for the North Slope. And across the Chukchi coast, 25 to 30. Winds diminish outside of Kotzebue Sound at 15 knots with a 5-foot sea. And again, watch for freezing spray threats across the Beaufort Sea coast for Thursday. Recapping tonight's weather, low pressure across the Bering Sea, warm and wet weather for southeast, and colder air trying to drop southward across the North Slope. That'll bring some snow a little bit further south as we get into the midweek. Rain continues across the Gulf Coast.
These forecasts are to be used for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.
Alyeska Pipeline Service Company, sustaining Alaska's pipeline and its operations today and into the future.